Hi, good afternoon, everybody. We went from total silence to an incredible hubbub of noise, and it's great to hear that and see it. Welcome to all of you. I'm John Cater. I have the privilege of being the university's Vice-Chancellor. Many of you will know me, one or two of you won't, but it's a real privilege to have you here today. But actually, the greatest privilege is to have the person with me on my left here, Baroness Cathy Ashton, honorary graduate of this university, but also, of course, someone who was born, brought up in this locality. Her father was a civil engineer. I think her family prior to that actually worked in the mining and the mill industries up here in Lancashire, and to someone who actually moved from, being, a local lass, if I can call it that, to actually one of, perhaps the two most significant women on the world stage, in the early years of the last decade. I think is, a real testament to her achievements, but actually also a real privilege for us, to have, Cathy with us here today. Cathy describes herself sometimes as an accidental politician, but I think what drives Cathy, and certainly from reading everything that I've read and listening to podcasts, is that desire to do good, to actually make society better, to improve opportunities, living chances, for people, and that's reflected right the way through the career. I mean, the early days with the campaign for nuclear disarmament, rising very quickly to the person who actually acted as the honorary treasurer, for that body, working with SETSWA, the Council for Social Work, Education and Training, coordinating business in the community, chairing a health authority, vice president of the National Council for one-parent families. What have we been doing with our lives? I mean, it's an absolutely phenomenal list, and that's, of course, before Cathy was created as a life peer in 1999. Obviously, took the title of Baroness Ashton, of Holland, working as a minister in the Department for Education and Skills, responsible for all education and training in the early years and primary, being identified, as a Minister of the Year and also as the Peer of the Year by the House magazine and by Channel 4. And if you think that's enough, in 2007, Cathy became leader of the House of Lords, and in 2009, the European Union's first High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. In effect, that is the foreign policy for 27 nations. Now, I'm going to leave Cathy to tell you about what she can talk about, but about brokering peace in Serbia, about re-establishing relations with Egypt after the Arab Spring, about denuclearizing Iran, about coordinating the West's response alongside John Kerry, to the Russian invasion of Crimea, pertinent to today. All of that are detailed in that excellent autobiographical account. And then what? Inside stories of 21st century diplomacy. Friends, colleagues, and as I said, it is my great privilege to introduce Baroness Cathy Ashton. Cathy, over to you.
Oh, it's hard to follow that. It's only me. I'm Cathy. I come from up the road. Just think of it like that. I thought what I'd do is use some of my personal photographs as slides to take you on a bit of the journey that I went on. I hope you'll read the book. You don't have to buy it. You can get it through the university library, apparently. It'd be nice if we bought a few copies, but there we go. But more importantly, I wrote it so I could talk about foreign policy from the standpoint of somebody who never expected to find herself being Europe's chief diplomat, and certainly never expected to find herself negotiating with the Iranians, dealing with Serbia and Kosovo, being in the Middle East, traveling to 103 countries, one way or another, to try and help support people who, as I said to some of the students earlier, just want what we've got. They want a life that is free and secure, that they can bring themselves and their families up, that they can enjoy and have fun and feel that there are opportunities for them. So always bear that in mind. Everywhere you go, everybody you meet wants what we've got. But I started off, this is to take you on the journey with me. That's Gordon Brown, remember him? That's me being told I've got this job, and Gordon, I'm not quite sure what he's saying to me. And there we are, these newly appointed people. You've got the president of the council, you've got the president of, who's actually the Prime Minister of Sweden, who's there, President Barroso, and me. I've dug out the jacket because I'm not expecting to be appointed and I'm actually out heading home for the weekend. So fortunately, there was a jacket that actually I could use. Then parliamentary hearings, creating the European External Action Service. That's me with some of the ambassadors that we appointed across the world. There was no service when I began. We had to create it from scratch. Military operations, the building that I chose, which was between the Council and the Commission in Brussels, all of those things had to be pulled together in the time that I served in office. And I worked with extraordinary people. Even from the back, you can tell who she is, who were real supporters. Angela Merkel, you'll remember, who said to me the day I was appointed, I support you today, I will support you every day, and did. Remember him? I've no idea what he's saying to me. He's probably telling me off for something or other. But I think we're in Moscow at that point. I remember him, the coolest man on the planet, as I would say, President Obama. William Hague, no doubt putting forward Britain's position on a variety of different things. Meetings across the world. It's in the Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma, Myanmar, which is a story I've not told, but it's a story of great tragedy. And of course, Santa Claus. And what's going on, just to make you laugh before I get onto the meat of it, is that the guy with the hat, who's not Santa, is the Finnish Foreign Minister, Erkki. And I'm doing a trip to the Arctic, and he wants to hand me over from Finland to Sweden. So we decided to do it at Rovaniemi with Santa. And the guy behind is Carl Bildt, who was Prime Minister of Sweden and then Foreign Minister of Sweden, who tweeted out that he had collected me from Santa in Rovaniemi and got in deep trouble with the Swedish government, who tweeted back, but surely you know, you're our Foreign Minister, that Santa lives in Sweden, not in Finland. And that's us checking off to Afghanistan, speaking at the Security Council. And this is just to prove I got the memo about the outfit. That's actually the quartet who were dealing with the Middle East: John Kerry, Ban Ki-moon, who was Secretary General of the UN, Sergei Lavrov, of whom more later, the Foreign Minister of Russia, and Tony as the quartet envoy. There aren't that many women in many of these pictures. Meeting in Myanmar under the largest picture I think I've ever seen, which is a feature actually of some countries. The Eternal Flame at Yad Vashem in Israel, playing ping pong in China, in one of the poorest villages in the southern region of China that I'd asked to visit, because the Chinese always said that in the West we understood Shanghai and Beijing, we understood the kind of developed part of China, but we had not seen the poorest part, to which I said, then take me there. So they did. And indeed, he was a better player than me, but at least I could vaguely hold my own. The council meetings where we pored over words that made a difference to whether we could get agreement or not. I think we're talking about the Serbia-Kosovo deal, and Angela Merkel is just checking my language to make sure I've not said anything she doesn't like. Speaking to the Serb Parliament, and the meetings in this rather bizarre room in Luxembourg of the EU, and then back to Hillary and to John Kerry as our greatest allies in terms of the work that we did. So a snapshot of some of the people, a snapshot of some of the things going on in Brussels. But I really want to talk about a few of the things that I learned. And you have to begin from the principle that there are no issues that we deal with as a nation that we deal with alone. None. We cannot solve pandemics. We cannot deal with climate change, the biggest challenge of all. We cannot provide security for our citizens. We cannot get economic growth without trade deals. We cannot do anything to enhance our country alone. How we choose to relate to others through treaties, through agreements, through informal relations. Well, there are lots of different ways you can do it, but you have to start from the principle that you can't do it alone. And once you realize that, everything that flows from it is about how do you build the right kind of relationships, what do they look like, and how do you resolve the issues that go with them. This is Mogadishu. Mogadishu is the capital of Somalia. I went there in August of 2013. I'm sitting inside a heavily armoured vehicle because the government controls exactly 1 mile square around the airport and nothing else. It's badly damaged, as you can see, from 22, 23 years then of civil war. And it's trying to get on its feet. I'm there because we're going to open an embassy, which is actually a metal hut on the beach, because that was the only safe place we had. But we flew the EU flag. And then I went to look at the military mission, because the biggest problem in 2009-10 that I was confronted with when I started in the job was piracy off the coast of Somalia. Some of you might remember it. It was the #1 issue. It was impossible for people to be able to guarantee that they could get their trade and their goods across the basin of Somalia. And the pirates were often 14 and 15-year-old boys who had been persuaded that they could get $10,000 if they were able to hijack a ship. The alternative for these young boys, because schools weren't functioning, was maybe, if they were lucky, $1 a day in some project that either the UN or the EU or somebody else would be running somewhere on the land. So $10,000 was a huge incentive to go out in unseaworthy boats. And we had the challenge of achieving 2 things. One is, how do you stop piracy? How do you deter it? Well, you do that through a military mission. So a military corridor of ships made up of largely EU countries, but other countries as well, that created a corridor that if the trade ships, the commercial ships, stuck to the corridor, they would safely cross this vast expanse of water. Communication systems that the pirates couldn't listen into. And of course, arresting pirates and dealing with them. But that only takes you so far, because you don't have decent prisons in Somalia. It's a country in civil war. Seychelles, which was this beautiful set of islands for any of you who've been, had 30% of its prisoners were young pirates that they'd captured. They had lost 100% of their cruising trade, the cruise liners that had come to the Seychelles from all over the world, as people cruised across that part of the world, had disappeared. 100% went, because it was too dangerous. And they couldn't afford the petrol to put in their boats to be able to monitor every single one of the islands. So they were in deep trouble. But we could capture these young guys. We could capture, if we were lucky, the warlords who were employing them. But what do we do with them? So we needed to think about prisons and rehabilitation. And then if you're going to rehabilitate people and you're going to train them, well, train them for what? There were no jobs. So the lesson that I took away that began with Somalia was, there is no point in solving one bit of a problem. However much the issue of piracy affected us directly as an international community, however much it was important to get hostages released, get back the ships, get trade, and get the World Food Programme, which was badly affected, to be able to deliver food to the poorest people in the world. We were not going to solve the problem if we simply tackled the manifestation of the problem that we could see in front of us. So it led me to think about a comprehensive approach, and this was the conference that we put together in Brussels, which brought all of the financial institutions, World Bank, the IMF, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, with all of the member states of the EU, all of the African nations directly affected, to build the capacity to support Somalia into its future. The then president, who's now president again, despite many attempts to kill him, he's managed to survive and he's been willing to serve again. Mohammed is a really important man because he has credibility with the institutions. He wants to build the right kind of institutions for the future. And he ran a campaign for the young boys that was simply called "Give Up Your Guns and Go to School," to try and get the basics back into community life, schools, healthcare, all the things that we understand and take for granted. So the first thing, and the most important perhaps, is that when you're thinking about foreign policy, you're thinking about what to do in the situation I found myself, there's little point in tackling one bit of the problem. The problem we saw was at sea, the solution was on the land. But you know, one of the great challenges we face is how life can change in an instant. And this is a trip that I made to Haiti in the earthquake of 2010. In 35 seconds, 230,000 people died. Many of them were people who ran the government, all the civil servants. The UN was hosting a big meeting for all the international community to talk about what next to support Haiti. Everybody in the meeting died. A poor country that has been in receipt of aid for, well, since 1953, I think, still in receipt of aid. 65% of people who won election to be MPs had never had a job before. A country in need of everything. And one of the challenges about it was how to try and support and get the message across about how much we needed to do, how life had completely altered. I'd never been to an earthquake zone before. I'd never seen houses that look as if you pick them up and turn them upside down. I'd never slept through or tried to sleep through aftershocks that rocked the house I was in and made us think we'd have to fly out, get out of the way. And this little boy was a young boy who was in a project run by the Irish government, therefore part of my EU team, as it were, who, well, we took the picture and it was in The Guardian and it went round the world as this great symbol of me, this child, because it looked like this poor little boy is really sad. That's him with his sister. Actually, what happened was the photographer got too close and he got scared, so he went like that. But it was a great image, and he was very special. And all of these children have lost their homes. This is the father telling me about what has happened to his family. Children, the young boy that I've got my arm round told me he doesn't know where his father is. He just wants to try and find him. And then all of the people who came together to try and support what was happening in Haiti. This is the ships, the Italian and Spanish Navy were there. They brought hospital ships because when you have a place so devastated, 95% of the centre of Port-au-Prince, the capital, was gone. So you are literally with rubble, you can't get anywhere, but you can bring hospital ships that are able to support people and deal with the injuries and problems that they face. And then we went to see the president, who is in shock. And the lesson really from the Haiti experience, this is Kristalina Georgieva. She now runs the IMF, but she was a commissioner with me, responsible for some of the international crises. And we're sitting on a balcony in half a police station, which is all that's left really of the buildings around that are devastated. But the thing about Haiti was that you have to take a traumatized country and think about how you're going to do things in the longer term. We had to think, what could we do that would not just put back the buildings that were destroyed, but would offer something different? And a lot of the challenge when disasters suddenly hit is not just the immediate. If you look at the Prime Minister who's sitting beside me, you may not be able to see it, but he's completely traumatized. I mean, he could hardly speak because they have witnessed, they are living with these terrible circumstances. And I wanted to contrast it with Japan. This is the wake of the tsunami in Japan, which you've all seen on an almost endless loop. You can watch documentaries about it all the time. But this is 8 months after the tsunami hit. And I'm down in Matsushima, which is the most badly affected place, not so far from Fukushima. You remember the nuclear power plant that was badly damaged. And 8 months later, Japan, one of the great industrialized countries, is still dealing with the aftermath. Under this water are houses that have disappeared. And while I was standing there, a suitcase with a pair of trainers in it floated past me. If you look down, you can see bicycles, you can see cars. Utter devastation. So even countries that are perfectly capable of meeting the challenges for their people find themselves in times of devastation. And it's worth remembering, and the reason for showing this really is about, again, back to the longer term, that if we don't think about how we're going to not just participate in the immediate aftermath of a crisis, but how we're going to solve what happens next, how we're going to offer support to even the most industrialized, richest countries, then we risk a problem. And here I am in a schoolroom with the clock, and the clock has stopped at the moment that the earthquake happened. So, number 2, the long term. How do we make sure that we think about the long term in the context that life can change very suddenly? But I want to take you to Egypt. It's a pyramid. You'll recognize it. Tahrir Square, where the demonstrations took place in what we call the Arab Spring. One of the first things that somebody said to me when I was standing in the square was, Cathy, please don't call it the Arab Spring. It's the case that in Egypt, when the spring comes, it brings the hot Sirocco winds, it brings dust, it's not pleasant. You're making it a European thing, or a British thing. It's not. Spring is different. And it made me realize that, of course, we approach crises from our own perspectives. We look at things and think, oh, this looks like something we recognize, and we give it a name that makes sense to us, but it may not be the right name for the circumstances. And the point about showing you the story of Egypt is what I call deep democracy. This is President Morsi, Mohamed Morsi. He was elected representing the Muslim Brotherhood, the Freedom and Justice Party, as president. He won with 1 million votes. He was later removed and taken away and eventually imprisoned, where he died not long ago. He's a very interesting man because he used to work on the space shuttle as an engineer. Speaks very good English, but had no idea what he wanted to do as president. And the challenge for Egypt was also reflected in the challenges that we faced in many parts of the Arab world in what we call the Arab Spring. I spent a long time in Egypt. These are different groupings, negotiating with them after Morsi has been removed, to see whether we can find a way to continue the democratic journey that is Egypt. And this is then Defense Minister al-Sisi, who later became and remains President al-Sisi of Egypt. The point of that story, and I'll come on to say a little bit about Libya, is something that I call deep democracy. That when countries go through dramatic change, revolution if you like, there is usually a call for a better democratic future, and it's a good thing. But the call translates very quickly into we need an election. And elections are really, really, really important. But if I say to you that in terms of democracy, they are the cherry on the icing on the cake, because elections only work if you know who you're voting for, if you know that your vote is going to be counted, if you have the ability to go and vote, if you have an independent media that can report, if you have political parties who can put forward their plans and ideas, if you are able to rely on the legal system, the judicial system, if you have NGOs and voluntary organisations and civil society, if you are free to speak your mind, if you are free to travel to see your neighbours, if you live, in other words, in the kind of democracy that we understand. And I call that deep democracy, the interwoven nature of all of the elements that make up a democratic framework. And then elections happen in that context where you may end up with people you don't like being elected. It's within a framework that works. And that framework gets tested, and sometimes very much tested almost to destruction, but it works. And it works because it's deep and it's able to withstand and to create the circumstances that allow you to do the thing that is most important of all, which is to throw governments out. The point about elections for me is not so much about who you elect in, but the fact that you can get rid of people you really don't like. And that's why when people get into power who want to stay in power, the first thing they do is make it harder to vote, remove polling stations, intimidate voters, find reasons not to call an election, all of those things, because they know that is your opportunity to say, thank you very much, but actually we've had enough of you one way or the other. And it's really, really important. But it only works if you've got choices. So the challenge in the Arab Spring and the challenge in Egypt was people had never heard of most of the candidates. There was very little opportunity to talk about the different ideas that people had. And they voted for the people they knew, people they'd heard of, people in their locality. And you then end up in a situation where you have a leader who believes that it is enough to be elected. When he was taken away at dead of night, nobody saw him for a month. And I asked Al-Sisi if I could go and see him. And in the book, I tell the story of being taken late at night in a car that the doors don't open, out into the desert with what I stood up in, no phone, no nothing, to be able to talk to him, to see that he was alive and that he was being looked after. And he said to me, do you remember the last words you said to me a month ago when I was in my presidential palace? And I said, I do. I said to you, it's not enough to be elected, Mr. President, it's what you do with it. Deep democracy means that there is an expectation that it's not enough to be elected. It's how you then move forward, and the ability for leaders to leave or be got rid of, not in a sense of killing them, but in the sense of getting them out of office if they can't live up to that. And in Libya, and I tell the story of Libya and the moves to create the circumstances where the Libyan people could move forward and that the Gaddafi would go. One of the biggest challenges we faced was trying to work out ways in which we could support them. It was a country that had, in theory, a government in waiting. A government that was sitting in Benghazi, a group of people who were better than many governments I've come across, people of real intelligence and ability who were thinking about all of the different issues ahead of them. But when they got into office, they decided they didn't have the authority, the opposite problem of the election, to be able to make any decisions. So part of the reason that Libya is in chaos is not because the international community wasn't prepared to help. it was because there was nobody to give us the authority to help them. To close the borders that were just porous. There were guns and weapons pouring through. There were people coming in, mercenaries being willing to join different factions in the government. We couldn't protect the borders. We couldn't bring the militia groups into the police forces. We couldn't help train the police forces to deal with the circumstances they found themselves. We couldn't do anything very much because you can't turn up with lots of police officers to train them and lots of customs officers to close the borders because it's called an invasion unless you have permission. And we simply couldn't get it. So a lot of things that go wrong in the transformation of a nation are not building this deep democracy, of not taking authority, of not being prepared to go through the different stages of democracy. And I would always tell them the story that for us, you know, democracy began in 1215 with Magna Carta, but it took 700 years before people that look like me could vote. Not very quick. It doesn't always happen as quickly as you want. It shouldn't take 700 years, by the way, but it is a process and it's a never-ending one. Democracy wobbles about. It doesn't go in a straight line. People get elected you don't want elected. There is trouble. There are difficulties. Populism takes over in some countries. We end up with leaders that we don't think are appropriate to lead big nations. I won't mention anybody in particular. But when it works because it has got depth and breadth and it's rooted. And so helping people root it is really important. I was asked to do two kinds of negotiation. The first that I'm going to talk about was between Serbia and Kosovo, where I effectively mediated. And I want you to imagine you all know of the wars of the collapse of former Yugoslavia, and then later the fight between Serbia and Kosovo, where Kosovo declared its independence from Serbia after what it believed was 1,000 years of being oppressed one way or the other. And the anger and hatred between the Kosovars and the Serbs was something that people talked about a lot whenever I traveled around the region. And I decided to bring together the two prime ministers, one from Kosovo, one from Serbia. They were the same age. They lived a few miles apart. They had never met. And they came into my office with their translators, one each, and met myself and my wonderful Italian expert, Fernando Gentilini. And they sat down on sofas and for 1 hour talked together. We took a photograph, and we had in those days memory cards. Remember those? I took the memory card out of the camera, put it in my pocket, and said, "This will never be seen unless you both decide that this, for you, is a good thing." And 24 hours later, they rang me to say, "Yes, please put the picture out." And it went all over the world. It was front page in Pakistan, in Sierra Leone. The American State Department kept sending me newspapers with a picture in it, and that's the picture. And you'll see me, and as you look at me, on my right is Ivica Dačić, who's the Prime Minister of Serbia. Then Fernando's next to me, and next to him is Hasim Thaçi, who is the Prime Minister of Kosovo. Now, in case you think these are people who are just look very nice in suits, Hasim is currently in The Hague on war crimes for allegedly participating in the murder of civilians. We shall see. He was head of the Kosovo Liberation Army. I have no idea if he's guilty or not, but he is in The Hague. They sat together and decided that there was a possibility that they could start to talk with each other, not about the big question of recognition of Kosovo, but whether we could make one small part of Kosovo, the north, where 60,000 people lived in what I described as the Wild West, a better place. Could we remove some of the tensions? Could we unblock some of the problems. Instead of 2 police forces, one from Serbia, one from Kosovo, have one. 2 justice systems, have one. Open the customs gates without them being burnt to the ground, which happened quite regularly. And over the course of the next year, we did. Hillary Clinton wanted to show her support, so she flew me to Serbia and Kosovo in her big plane to tell them to do, as she put it, do what she says, which was nice. And that's one of the very first times that they actually could shake hands with each other. Those pictures weren't shown to people for quite a long time. And eventually, we signed the Brussels Agreement. I'm grinning because they're signing. I stole it, actually. I have it at home, the Brussels Agreement. And it was not rocket science, it was not revolution, but it was an absolute beginning. And then here I am explaining to Angela Merkel in particular that I need the EU to do its part. And the big thing about this goes back to the point about we're all in this together, or we have to do things together. What drew them into being willing to be together and to talk and to find agreement was a desire to be part of Europe. They believed the best way to provide security and economic growth for their people was to be part of Europe. Years later, at the Munich Security Conference, they asked me to sit with them while they explained to this audience of very elite military and leaders across Europe and the world how they did it. We joked all the way through about it. But if you'd looked at the audience, people stood in disbelief that these 2 people could sit on a platform together, because they, in that first meeting, had sat down with the devil. They had sat down with the one person, when they got home, people were going to say, how could you? How could you sit, you, the Serbian Prime Minister, with the Kosovo person, these people that have broken away from us and pretended they're a country, and they would say to the Kosovo Prime Minister, how could you sit with the people who oppressed us? And in case you think it was easy, it was a series of 14-hour sessions over many, many months where at the drop of a hat, they would start screaming about the Battle of Kosovo as this absolutely visceral thing that had happened. It happened in 1389. Long memories. And the second negotiation I got involved in, this is the Foreign Minister of Iran, Javad Zarif, where we, as you know, sought to find a way to show that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon, and to do so by giving the world confidence in Iran's purely peaceful civil nuclear program. And what was interesting about it, apart from the fact it took 4.5 years of my life, I spent more time with the Iranians than with my family, and then Donald Trump ripped it up. Apart from that, was that the group involved was what we call in America the P5+1 and in Europe the E3+3. And there they are. I'm back. William Hague, you remember him? Britain, Germany, China, America, Russia, France. E3, the European 3, Britain, Germany, France, +3, China, America, Russia, or P5, permanent 5 members of the Security Council, China, Russia, America, Britain, and France, +1, Germany. And that was a team that actually, in the end, did the nuclear deal. Interesting of itself, but what was also interesting for me was at the time, not exactly at this moment, but weeks later, was when Russia took Crimea. And we continued the nuclear negotiations throughout the period of the crisis in Ukraine. And it mattered because it shows that when you think about the big questions we have to address, of which climate change is the most obvious, we're going to have to do some compartmentalization of issues, especially with China, if we're going to find a way through. Lots of hugging, but we'll go through that. And then my last lesson, in terms of all the things that we did or didn't get right is, of course, Ukraine in this context, in this book. This is President Yanukovych, who decided he would not sign an agreement that had been 7 years in the negotiation, had been initialed because it was finished, and at the 11th hour, he decided not to sign it. And the demonstrations began in Maidan. That's me going to Maidan. I'm doing a press conference afterwards about what is going on in Ukraine and my concern that Yanukovych is not signing, but is not prepared to explain to his people why he is not. Not only not prepared to explain, but this is laying flowers after 77 people in Maidan have been shot. Eventually he went, and we had a new government in Ukraine, and it led to discussions in Minsk. This is Lukashenko, president of Belarus, and this rather odd lineup. You see, I'm often the only woman in the list, in the lineup. You have the president of Kazakhstan, President Nazarbayev, you have Vladimir Putin, you have Lukashenko of Belarus, Poroshenko, who was then president of Ukraine, and myself with two of my colleague commissioners in Minsk to try and see if we can find a way through and put together a bilateral discussion between Russia and Ukraine. But the big lesson that I learned from the work that we did in Ukraine was, if you don't deal with the problems, they don't deal with themselves. Why do we think that if we don't solve a problem, it is going to do anything else other than fester and turn into something else? We didn't do enough to sort out Ukraine then. Now we have the war in Ukraine. And I can apply that to the Middle East, of course, where I spent more time than anywhere else, as we think about what's happening there. And so my biggest lesson of all is, you have to look after the problems, you have to think longer term. And we do it for these people, for all of these children. China, the first lot, by the way, were Afghanistan, and China, in Haiti, on the West Bank, Gaza, Sderot in Israel, where the children had to play underground because of the missiles. This is the Return of the Sun Festival in Svalbard, where I went just after the shootings in the island in Norway, because many of the children who were shot came from Svalbard. And there they are, getting ready for the sun. This is back in Gaza, I think. It's a school for deaf children. This is Myanmar, where the water still doesn't get pumped through. Children all over the world. Thank you very much.
There was a kind of wonderful circularity of that, wasn't it? Your very first job as a minister, with young children under the age of 11, and coming back actually to our responsibility, to that next generation of young children as well. And now Cathy has very, very kindly actually offered, to take, questions and answers. We've got about, 12, maybe 15 minutes or so. So what I'm going to do is invite those, and actually I can see in the background there a very familiar face to me, Paula. So over to you first.
Okay, that was a really fascinating talk, and I'm glad we've recorded it. My question is, if you were giving one piece of advice to the person who is now performing your role, what would it be?
It would be to focus on one or two areas where you think you can make a difference, and stick to it. Do not give up, and build in a long-term plan. Fundamentally.
Okay. At the back, sorry.
Yeah.
Hi there, Cathy. Thank you very much. So my question is sort of even thinking of neighbours who might fall out for 20 years, over something simple like a garden fence and won't speak to each other and
Yep.
hate each other. How do you actually begin that first step of getting sort of two people to speak to each other when atrocities have taken place which are unspeakable? How do you actually make that first step, actually getting them to think away from the emotion?
So I don't necessarily take them away from the emotion, but, and it doesn't always work, but I start from, what is it you want to do? You know, you've become a leader, or you become a person, the neighbours across the fence. What do you want this to look like in 5 years' time? How many flowers are you going to rip out? How much trouble are you going to... It's not worth it. You have a responsibility to make the life of the people you live next to, as well as the people you live with, as good as it possibly can be. So with the leaders of countries, with Serbia and Kosovo, my question was, what are you going to leave the next generation? Is it just more of this stuff? Or are we going to do something different? And if you're not interested in doing something different, get out of my office. But if you are interested in doing something different, let's do it, but let's do it together. So we don't, it's not about one being seen as heavier or more important than the others. It's about, in their case, both of you. And I think that's where I start, which is your next generation deserve better.
In the front here.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I just want to know, what's your one advice? Thank you very much. I just want to know, what's your one advice for young people who might want to, go into the line of diplomacy, especially, navigating the murky waters of interest and politics and all of that?
So there are sort of two basic ways that I think about careers. One is expertise. That there are lots of people, and you may be one of them, who develop real expertise on particular things. It might be theoretical physics, it may be a part of the world that you're really interested in, it may be economics, whatever it is. And you can get into diplomacy by becoming the expert on those particular things where that expertise is really needed. Or you can be like me, I'm an expert in nothing. But I have a skill set, and I've used it as chair of a health authority when I had to merge hospitals. That was tricky. I've used it as leader of the House of Lords when I had 22% of the vote and I couldn't afford to lose a vote. So you negotiate. And I've used it in the negotiations or in the work that I've done. And, first advice is find which one you are. You may be both, but often people tend to be one or the other. And then think about where you would like to use that expertise or that skill set. Because negotiation and international work is everywhere. And you can be everywhere. But you really do need to work out what kind of thing you're interested in. Because some of it is soul destroying and extremely, not much difficult. It's just, you find it's not for you. Lots of people are really good at some aspects of it, but they can't do other things. They find it very difficult to spend the time. You've got to be prepared to spend days without sleep and get nowhere. You've got to be prepared to spend time developing an understanding of an issue. I could probably have done, well, not sure a degree, but certainly an A-level in nuclear physics when I was doing the Iran deal, because I had to understand it, so they couldn't catch me out. Who wants to spend days poring over books like that? So find which one you are, and then look at the area you want to go in, and then head for it.
Thank you. There's two things I'd like to ask you. One is about corruption and how you deal with that, because clearly that's going to happen in a lot of countries. And the second thing is we're very fortunate in this country to have a working democracy, but we can't just bolt that onto another country. How do we get this deep democracy that you talk about in really what are countries that haven't really got that?
Yeah.
Haven't even got the start of it.
So corruption is a big issue in many, many countries. You deal with it, I think, in two ways. One is that you acknowledge it and make it clear that it's got to be sorted out, and you don't give them the resources in a way that allows that corruption to continue. So there are plenty of countries, I won't name, who coming into the EU had real problems internally of corruption. Small-scale corruption as much as big-scale corruption. Lots of things that are just grown up as habit that you have to kind of stamp out. So it's about giving them the tools to do it, the experts who know how to find it and challenge it, being prepared to ensure they use the rule of law against it, changing the culture that exists within it, and making sure that they can't use what you give them in a corrupt way. And then in terms of deep democracy, you're exactly right. Lots of countries would like to go in that direction but don't have the basics. And I think it's about, again, finding the elements that I described. So making sure that there is a free press, making sure that they do allow trade unions to operate, for example, that they do allow civil society, changing the way that they form their institutions, helping them to create ministries of justice or whatever it is, which is what we did in Somalia. You know, when we got to Libya, I was the first foreigner to walk over the threshold of the building that housed all of their NGOs. The Gaddafi had never allowed anybody to go in. So they often exist, they've just never been allowed to flourish. And you find people willing to spend a lifetime developing those institutions and those organizations. So our job is to help them do it.
Right at the very back, Jeff, I think the microphone is this way.
Excuse me, I've got a cold. Wonderful talk, by the way. Yeah, I suppose I wanted to ask you about trust, really, because kind of core to everything you do is the concept of trust. And even without a record of past behaviour and past conflict, it's still a complex thing in that as human beings, we do tend to make judgments about trustworthiness pretty rapidly. And as an expert negotiator and the kind of dealings you've had, how did you go about projecting your trustworthiness, and how did you go about preventing yourself from making quick judgments about other people in the light, A, of their history, and B, of what you felt when you met them?
I think on the latter thing, you know, you are by definition, people you're negotiating with may not become your best friends. You may think they should be in prison rather than across the table. But that's irrelevant to the job that you have to do. So the first thing you do is suspend all that. But building the trust is critical in my view. And I did it in these particular cases that I've done it differently in different circumstances. So with the Iranians, I developed it by always the night before every round of negotiations, I had dinner with the chief negotiator. And we'd talk about families, where we came from, about culture, about anything and everything except the talks. And I said to them, you will never hear me give a press conference on what we are discussing that you have not seen what I'm going to say beforehand. You will never see me do a briefing, and I will never lie to you. And I didn't. It didn't mean I told them everything, but I didn't lie. So if I said, we can't do that thing you want, they knew I meant it. And building that relationship so that what they said to me stayed with me was critical. And in the case of Serbia and Kosovo, the message was that my office is your space. You can say anything in here. You can try out any idea. You can risk everything. Doesn't matter. But what I promise you is that I will make sure neither of you kind of bullies the other or does things to the other that they feel they have to give in to. And we would check everything all the time with them on their own. Are you happy? Are you sure? Can you get this sorted out at home? How can I help you? And so on. And you build that relationship over time. So it's about how you are seen by them and what you're prepared to do for them.
Okay. Further questions? Yes, young man here.
Baroness Ashton, thank you for coming. Do you think that the European Union has any intrinsic weaknesses in its structure, and also the advent of an organisation like BRICS, how does that affect the future of the European Union?
I mean, the European Union's, one of its issues really is, as it goes bigger, it's got an institutional setup that was set up in the 60s and 70s that's trying to operate when it's got 28 and it's going to have a lot more countries. But But I think they know that. So structurally, there's a lot to be done to think about how do you make a structure work that's going to represent all the countries effectively, but isn't just going to be about adding more and more people. Whether they move to qualified majority voting as opposed to unanimity, they're to be seen. I think there are issues in either direction for doing that. The challenge really for Europe is that there's always an election somewhere. I would chair the Foreign Affairs Council, and a foreign minister would do something really weird. They would make some great statement that had no relevance whatsoever to what we were discussing. And then I'd think, oh, it's an election, because they wanted to go out and say to the press, and I said this. You were always having at least one, if not two or three countries about to change governments, sometimes quite radically. And with coalitions, you would change the leader, who would then be on the European Council, and the foreign minister, who was often their rival in a different party, because you give them the foreign ministry to get them out of the country, who would be my sort of counterpart. So it has challenges to do with the fact that it's constantly changing. Sometimes for the better. I think what's happened in Poland is really good. Sometimes, in a more concerning way, or a way that we need to watch, as has happened in Slovakia. So it has lots and lots of issues, but it is quite a remarkable thing that you can keep trying to set fire to it and it still manages. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It's an interesting group of democracies and non-democracies, and there is talk about it being expanded. Russia sort of is the secretariat to it. Well, good luck with that, because the whole point about countries coming together and forming strong organizations is that you share the same values and ideas for the future. And even within the BRICS now, there are fundamental differences between India and China, between Russia and Brazil, between South Africa. It's convenient for very particular reasons, but the idea that it would deepen into something like the EU is not going to happen.
Just a couple more questions then.
Yeah, first of all, thanks very much again. It was an excellent talk. I suppose I wanted to follow up in some ways from what Jeff was saying, as well as that issue of kind of personal trust. As representing a powerful external actor, there are many of the parts of the world that you're describing have long histories of, let's say, more problematic relationships with some of the states that you're describing, and a doubt of their intentions, shall we say, that is well founded very often. And I just wondered how you go about the business really of establishing yourself as a good faith actor in a context where, actually with good reason, many people will be looking with considerable suspicion.
So I would start my conversations in some countries with the words, I'm British, whatever we did, I'm sorry. And if we didn't do it, one of the others did. So I'm sorry for that too. And I would say, I come from a continent that has got a history of being better at killing itself than anything you can dream of. We have done it in the most terrible and appalling ways for a long time, and we don't do it anymore. We try and resolve our issues as far as we can around a table. We try and look for common ways to go forward. We've understood these things called human rights and values and democracy and so on. All I offer you is, can we help? And that's what I would say. It's not about going in going, I'm from head office, I've come to help you, right? It's about saying, is there anything I can do? And in most circumstances when countries are going through turmoil, they do want help. It might be that they need more resources. It might be that they need advice. It might be that they need something. And all you are doing is positioning yourself to try and help. Within that, you may sometimes be giving them some tough messages as well. That, I once said to a leader, I can't believe I did this over the phone, stop shooting people through the window, because we could see him on television doing that. I'm not quite sure what he was doing really. He wasn't actually shot anybody, but he might well have killed somebody by accident. You have to be prepared to say, that you come with your values as part of who you are. So I would say in all countries, for human rights to apply to anybody, you simply have to be human. There are no other criteria. So don't give me this stuff about you're not applying rights equally, because it's not right. And if they know who you are and what you think and what you believe, and you're prepared to help and roll your sleeves up, it's not about swanning and swanning out, it's about staying for days and weeks and whatever, then that's all you can do. And you have to just accept the past and say, well, sorry.
Who would like the privilege of the last question? Please, John. Okay, I have to do two.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, we'll take the one at the back as well.
There's one over there as well.
Oh, that kid. Okay, right. We're down to three then. Okay, I'll Sarah will run around with the mic. So.
Thank you. It's so inspiring to hear you speak. I just wondered, in those countries like our own, where we might assume that there is deep democracy, to what extent would you say that democracy is under threat? And what would you say was the biggest threat currently?
Can we do multi? Oh, I thought you were I don't mind. I mean, I can answer that quickly while Sarah's doing it. You always have to look after democracy. Whether you look at it now and think, are there real challenges to it? And you can think of that in the context of it's harder for people to vote because they need ID. What's that about? Do we really love GB News? Or you can look at that in demonstrations that are happening in this country that are dividing communities right now, and what does that mean, and so on. There are lots of different things that you can kind of worry about. And you're right to worry because it's fragile always. So it's a very basic point. Things will not stick if you don't look after them. So looking after our democracy and checking its health and having independent bodies that look after our elections and so on is really, really important.
There was two hands, one on this side and one at the very bottom over here. So
You are going to get the last question, literally.
where was the hand?
Sorry, did I dream it? Yes, it was.
Oh, right.
Tim.
Thank you, that was absolutely amazing. I just wondered, you commented on several times that you were the only woman in those photographs, and I've been trying to frame this question for quite a while, but was it really difficult to be a woman? Obviously some of those regimes you were talking to do not encourage women into leadership, obviously, or was it sometimes a benefit?
I never found it a problem. People often assume, for example, with the Iranians it would be an issue. It wasn't. The Iranians have women running businesses, they're professors in universities. There are issues, we know, big issues about the role of women in Iran. But in terms of dealing with women who have senior positions, that was not an issue at all, and they could not have been easier from that point of view. I never found it a real problem. I sometimes found it useful. And I was describing to you that in the context of the Serbia-Kosovo prime ministers, they would occasionally get very cross with each other. And there'd be quite a lot of heated words. And I would sit with my arms folded and look at the floor. And I described it, which was not my original phrase, but I stole it from someone else, as the disappointed mother. So sometimes, men and women's lives are different. We grow up slightly differently. We have the way that we relate to people is slightly different. Women tend to have a life that is, I think, more about negotiating with people all the time. But that's a stereotypical me generalizing. But my life was certainly that. And you approach things slightly differently. Men can stand up and yell at each other. We're smaller generally. It's harder. You don't approach things in the same way. But that's good. So the best negotiating teams are always men and women together. Because the men do brilliant things, the women do brilliant things, and together you have the full package.
And final question. Thank you.
Just before
Hello, that's on. I have a little bit of experience with microphones. Okay, that's a different thing. Just before I ask my question, I'd just like to say you're so humble in everything that you've achieved. You described yourself before as an expert in nothing, and I think anyone here can see the way you've been with the people, the way we see you in the photographs with children who've lost everything, with the president, former president of the United States. You are an expert in the most important skill, and that's being able to work with people. And I just like to say that before I ask my question. My question is...
Embarrassing. Good question.
You're so humble, you really are, in everything you've achieved. Who's the most difficult world leader or representative you've ever worked with?
I think Vladimir Putin probably takes the... Yeah, and the reason I say him was that I had, on the Iran negotiations, Russia was part of our team. So I had many conversations with him that were very positive because he did support what I was doing with that and supported his team. And we worked with them right the way through the beginnings, at least, of what was a crisis in Ukraine and the taking of Crimea, but not yet the full-scale war. But what you find in him is somebody who is very transactional, that it's about not a shared future or a shared venture or a shared way of trying to tackle a problem, but much more about what can you do for me. So his interest, I felt, in the EU was only insofar as it would benefit his objectives, his country, his desires for his own future, his desires for where Russia would be. And when you're trying to do something with people who share the same landmass, after all, who don't see that there is the possibility of doing anything together, and who at times are pretty contemptuous of the idea that this is a good thing. He didn't like that Europe came together. He saw that as a real challenge. And that, people say, well, he was worried about NATO, which is why he went to try and invade Ukraine. NATO was nowhere near the conversation. It was about the EU. Now more or less guarantees that Ukraine will get into NATO, but that was not, in the original discussions, something that Ukraine was particularly thinking about, at least not in the short term. And I think that he, therefore, is somebody who, as we think about how to negotiate, people sometimes say to me, if you were doing negotiations with Ukraine, I find it quite hard to imagine how that would work with him. And most people you can see the potential way through, but perhaps not with him.
Thanks, Cathy. And on that rather sad note, I guess, but
you've
been incredibly generous with your time, but
Pleasure.
in many ways, rarely an hour has passed so quickly and in such fascinating company. It's a real privilege for the university to have you as one of our honorary doctors, and it's an absolute delight that you've been here today. But there's actually a bit of me that wishes you weren't here.
Thanks. That's very nice, isn't it?
What I mean by that is that actually the kind of skilled diplomacy that you advocated, around the world, and which we've seen so much of, is something we're probably seeing less of today. It may be going on behind the scenes, but and it's clearly never as a skill. I think been more necessary. I know actually when you started this, back in 2008, 2009. There was enormous scepticism out there in the world about your appointment, about your capacity to undertake the role and the like. And I also know, and from conversations we've had, that for a year or two, you were confronted by a pretty hostile media, to the extent to which even going out of your own house or whatever was a challenge. What I then actually looked at what people have said subsequently. To quote Hillary Clinton, I love working with her and spending time with her, and I admire greatly her grasp of very complex issues that we both face. The Polish Prime Minister, she has an impossible job to do, and she's doing it well. She will leave an enormous legacy. She is discreet, perceptive, but also tenacious. Looking to someone really hostile, Peter Oborne, writing in the Telegraph, really hostile to that appointment at the very beginning. What did Peter Oborne at least have the grace to say, as Cathy came towards the end of her term? In her unobtrusive but tenacious way, she can boast real achievement. What she has achieved in Serbia and Kosovo, no one believed was possible. Her successor will struggle to match Baroness Ashton in calibre and in clout. And so we're delighted to have someone who was described, I think, rightly, as a real beacon of humility, but also actually, in my view, a great humanitarian as well. And it's been a real privilege, actually, Cathy, to spend an hour and a quarter with you this afternoon. Thanks, everybody, for being here, but in particular, enormous thanks to Baroness Cathy Ashton. Thank you.